Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, I will be tackling surf perch from the beach of beautiful Northern California. On a previous episode, while I was fishing a Half Moon Bay, I caught a handful of surf perch and quite a few anglers were very interested in how to target this species. However, their main concern was if they didn't want to fish a jetty, how would they target this species from a beach? So in today's episode, I will cover that. The Northern California beach I've chosen to target today is rather snaggy, so I will target the beach with a 3-way rig, just as I would target the jetty. The reason I'm not using a Carolina rig is because this beach, Pescadero, is known for its high amount of overgrown kelp beds and quite a bit of rocks located around randomly the sand. Some anglers might wonder why I would not use a high-low rig. The reason I don't like using a high-low rig is because I'm incredibly lazy and I really don't like to retie. I prefer the 3-way rig because whenever I lose a piece of component, I could just retie that component. Whereas if I were to lose the high-low rig, more times than not, I will end up losing the entire rig. My philosophy is the more time an angler spends fishing versus re-rigging, an angler will have more opportunity to catch more fish versus spending time retying rigs and components on the beach. That is just my preference, however, and a lot of anglers will say elsewise, but this is how I would prefer to target this particular beach and area. As for why I'm not using a Carolina rig, the reason I don't like to use a Carolina rig at this particular beach is because a Carolina rig is well suited to fish very clean bottom with very little vegetation. It is perfectly fine to use a Carolina rig to fish clean beaches where the perch are openly roaming the sandbars. However, at Pescadero, a lot of these perch will be holding very tight the solid structure and the kelp beds, so therefore a 3-way rig, in my opinion, is superior to the Carolina rig. As for the hook I prefer to use, I really like light wire hooks. A lot of anglers will fish a much heavier gauge hook, and I really don't like that, especially when just fishing for perch. I've never had a perch that will bend out these light wire hooks. As for the leader material, I'll go with 8-pound fluorocarbon. If this beach were clean, like many beaches, if I were to go up north toward Pacifica, I would actually scale down a 6-pound fluorocarbon. The conditions today got the water rather murky, so therefore 8-pound fluorocarbon is perfectly fine. I'll have this roughly about 6 inches on one of the rings on the 3-way swivel, and that's all I'll need. Some anglers might wonder why I wouldn't use a drop shot then. I don't like using a drop shot, especially when fishing for perch, because with a drop shot, the bait will be fixed. With a 3-way rig, the bait can flutter whenever the waves push and retract. This is the preferred rig I like to fish. Now as for where the area I want to fish this in, I am looking for an inner trough. A lot of these perch, particularly here at Pescadero, are looking for safety and shelter away from the heavy waves that are crashing onto the beach. What I have in front of me here is a shallow trough that is being shielded by these rock croppings that are breaking down the waves that are crashing in front of me. This is a great area to target for perch, especially when the tides are low. These rock cropping will act almost as a natural barrier like a sandbar, where the perch will sit just right behind it as the waves crash the sand. Once I give this bait a cast out there, all I will do is just lift the rod tip up high and let the bank sinker scoop along the bottom. I ended up getting bit, and I knew right away that this trough did indeed have fish. The most difficult thing for an angler to understand is learning how to read water whenever fishing the surf. This was a very nice white surf perch. I am not retaining any fish today. As I've already mentioned in the past, I am not a big fan of eating these guys. I think they're overrated and they don't taste very good. However, the Chinese and Korean diaspora out here on the Pacific coast seems to enjoy eating this species. They often describe this fish to me as tasting just like a pompano. But I really don't think this fish tastes anything like a pompano. If anything, it tastes a lot much more like a sunfish that had been left out on a stringer far too long and not on ice. As for the bait, these perch are not picky. I am using just a small piece of shrimp because I really don't like to carry live pileworm. Pileworms are rather expensive and they don't keep too well when fishing. Some anglers don't mind using the pileworm because they'll carry a bunch of ice in their cooler and will often sit in an area all day. But I don't like that. Whenever I'm perch fishing, I really like to go on the move around the beach. So with that being said, carrying shrimp is a lot much easier because I could just cram a handful of shrimp into a little bait box, and that's good to go for me. Another thing I want to mention is I am not a big fan of wearing waders. I really like to wade Rhodesian style with just shorts. I ended up getting bit again, and these fish are schooling in this particular area. The tide is low, so I am able to approach much closer to the trough than I would if the tides were high. No two same area will fish the same from my experience. Some area will fish better on high tide and some area will fish better on low tide. This was another white surf perch. He's not as big as the last fish, but he's probably about 6 inches. I'll show him to you guys real quick before letting him go. In the state of California, there are no size limit for this species. The release will not be as pretty when I'm fishing saltwater because these waves are rather dangerous. I will watch the waves and I will approach the break slowly before tossing the fish in, and off it goes. So on the topic of waders again, I really don't like to wear waders until the water gets really cold, and that won't happen till about November. The reason I don't like to wear waders whenever I'm fishing from the beach is because with the waders I find that it really impedes my movement. I really like to move around the beach a lot whenever I'm fishing for surf perch. Some surf anglers don't mind the bait and weight game, and all they'll do is sit in a specific area with their rods and the rod holders, but I don't like to do that whenever I'm surf perch fishing. Therefore, I'd much rather prefer to be on the move. My preference is to be mobile and hunt these fish down. I really like the exploration aspect versus sitting there and waiting for the fish to come to me. There's nothing wrong with waiting for the fish, but I find that by walking the beach and exploring, I find this to be a much more fulfilling way to fish for the species. As for the technique itself, with the 3-way rig, all I will do is let the bank sinker roll. I ended up getting bit because once this bank sinker rolled into the trough, these fish were holding in this trough and they were not moving. The tide is low, so these fish are holding on the inside of these rock carving to avoid being smashed into the rocks. What will happen is these fish are trying to hold in the area of least resistance. This will make it easy picking for me today fishing from the beach, but in the next 2.5 hours when the tide comes in, this area will not be accessible to me. So I will capitalize on this area. Somehow I caught this really nice white surf perch, and I also ended up tangling a dead bird's wing. I'll show this really nice white surf perch to you guys real quick. This fish probably was about 12 inches. I am not retaining him, but I think he is very pretty and very gnarly looking. The tides are beginning to shift, so I will be extra careful as I approach the break. Alright buddy, off you go. So some anglers might be wondering, what do I mean by letting the bank sinker roll? What I will do is just give this bait a cast, and once it hits the bottom, I am going to tighten up the line and the waves will allow the sinker to roll. Currently the current is pushing right to left. The hole is on my left hand side, so by letting it roll, very similar to how I would drift bait in a river for salmon or steelhead or even trout, the concept is about the same. Once it rolls into the hole, that is where I will get bit. I ended up getting bit and I knew right away I got myself another perch. The concept is about the same whenever I'm fishing a Carolina style rig as well. If this beach were to be clean and didn't have so much random boulders, I would fish a Carolina rig and I would do about the same thing. The biggest difference, however, is the Carolina rig. Once the waves retract, I'll also be able just to drag the weight forward. To my surprise, this wasn't a white surf perch, but instead a walleye surf perch. Normally these guys aren't as distinguishable from the white surf perch, besides with the bars on their side, and they're pretty much bigger eyes than the white surf perch. These guys typically roam in a school that is densely packed, and where you catch one, you can often catch many. He is very pretty nonetheless. The tides were changing fast, so I'll be extra careful for the release. I won't approach the break as close as I would, and I'll just toss him back. With the tidal shift happening right now, an angler should be extra careful when approaching the waves. Never ever turn your back to the waves, because more times than not, if there were to be a rogue wave, the last thing an angler wants is to get swept off on their feet. The waters of Northern California all the way up to Washington are super cold. Within minutes, if an angler were to get swept out into the sea, an angler can often get hypothermia. Unlike the waters of Southern California where the water is warm, these Northern California waters are extra cold. I always take safety precaution first, and never will I approach an area if I know that the tides are changing fast. I ended up getting bit, however the tides were changing so fast that this area will be unfishable within half an hour. I will try and capitalize as many bites as I can before moving and exploring the rest of the beach. Safety is the most important thing to an angler when fishing from the beach. I cannot express how important it is to be safe, especially when targeting these fish from the beach, because the last thing you want to do is become a casualty out here. This was another very nice and pretty white surf perch. I'll show him to you guys real quick before returning him to the water. The tides were changing fast, so I want to get as much casting as I can before moving area. I am approaching the water with some caution, and I'll just give him a toss. As the tides begin to change, the access to this trough in front of me is beginning to get limited. It is harder and harder now to get the bank sinker out there to the trough. Some anglers might be wondering, why not I just use a heavier sinker then? Well, if I were to use a heavier sinker, I would end up having to put the rod in a rod holder and wait it out. That is a perfectly fine approach to target these fish when the tides change out. I don't like doing that, however, and I will find other areas that will fish better on the high tide. I ended up getting bit, and this will be my last fish before moving around the beach. Yes, an angler can sit perfectly still at a specific area if they like, but I much rather prefer a hunting style approach whenever I'm fishing for perch. But for the guys that can't really move around, maybe I'll get an episode out one day for you guys. For the folks that are wondering whether or not stripers can be taken from the beach with this approach, yes, you can absolutely take stripers from the beach of Northern California with this approach. I'll show this really nice perch to you guys real quick. I think this is a silver surf perch and not a white surf perch. But nonetheless, I can't really tell between these two species, so I'll give them a toss. So with the tide at its highest point now, I am going to target these rock outcroppings. However, I'm not just going to target any random rock outcropping, I am going to target a rock cropping where there is a cut. What is a cut, some of you guys might ask? This rock cropping will have multiple little rock outcroppings, but there is one specific cropping that will allow the water to move in and out at a much slower pace. This is what's called a cut. The easiest way I can explain it to a new angler is just think of it as a funnel where the bottom is a lot much smaller and where the waves are crashing in will be at a much higher volume. Because of this, it will slow down the movement of the water a lot much more, allowing these fish to sit behind this funnel and continue to pick apart baits that get squashed in. I cannot stress how important it is that no two areas will fish the same depending on the tides. I ended up getting bit, and I knew right away that the perch were sitting behind this cut. At low tide, this area will be dry, and an angler can pretty much sit at the bottom base of these rock outcroppings. However, the tide is at its highest now, so these perch are sitting where the angler would typically be able to stand at. This was another little white surf perch, and he's a bit on the small side, and I'll give him a toss back into the water. I can't preach enough how much an angler should pay attention to the tide change. This area, typically at its low tide, an angler can fish directly down below these rock outcroppings on the sand. However, an angler should pay attention to the tide change because safety is very important. If an angler weren't paying attention to the tide change, the water would be up to an angler's hip down there. I ended up getting bit, and I knew right away that with this tide change, the perch were schooling in here thick. These fish were beginning to hold in the same area that would typically be dry and less than a few feet deep. The biggest problem I seem to be getting right now, however, is the number of fish that were in here. The smaller grade of fish were in here with some of the larger fish, and I was having an extremely difficult time picking the larger fish apart from these smaller fish. I don't want to let them peck at the bait for far too long, because what will happen is these fish with a light wire hook will end up hooking themselves, and they might end up gut hooking, and I'm not looking forward to keeping any of them. The bites were coming in fast and furious with the tide at its highest point. They were stacked in here pretty thick behind that cut, so all I'm going to do is continue to target that area until the bites dry out. I finally managed to pick a better fish from the school that was stacked thick down there. I think this is a silver surf perch, and I'm pretty sure that this might be a silver, but I'll show him to you guys real quick nonetheless, and I'll give him a toss back down into the water. So hopefully today's episode explains my take on how I would like to target the surf perch species along the coast of California. And even if you are out there on the Oregon coast and Washington coast, the concept is about the same. By far, the easiest way to target these species is hands down with bait. Yes, you can absolutely target them with artificial lures if you like, but I find that to be a whole completely different game from that of live bait or bait in general. Maybe one day I'll cover on the topic of artificial, but for now, by far the easiest way for a new angler to start fishing with these species is hands down with bait, whether it be with shrimp, pileworms, or bloodworms. To my pleasant surprise, this was a calico surf perch. These guys typically run in very small intimate school, so I was very surprised to catch one today. Again, I'll show them to you guys real quick, and off he goes. I'm going to see if I can get a few more bites before calling it quits for the day. The waves were smashing quite violently in front of me on these rock outcroppings, and it is making for some very miserable fishing. I wanted to hit a few more spots on the way out, but the biggest problem that had been showing up had been the number of surfers that are beginning to show up on this beach. I am not very fond of fishing near these surfers, so I will call it quits for the day. I ended up getting bit, and I knew right away that this was a better fish from the school. Just as water recreational users in freshwater are the bane to the bank angler, well, surfers in my opinion are the bane to the surf fishermen out here on the coast. This was another very nice white surf perch, and I'll show him to you guys real quick before letting him go. So for the guys out there that are wondering whether or not these species can be taken off the beaches of California successfully, yes they can. I'll show this fish to you guys real quick, and he is very pretty nonetheless. Off you go, buddy. It had been a great day so far because I caught quite a number of perch for the camera today. I didn't expect to catch this many fish today. However, I think it was because earlier in the day the sun wasn't out, so the number of surfers weren't really out here in numbers. But when the clouds dissipated and the sun came out, the numbers of surfers on this beach began to increase, so therefore I will call it quits for the day. I am not too fond of fighting surfers over specific areas to fish. I ended up getting bit, but this was a much smaller white surf perch from the school. The tides were at its highest peak right now, and the waves were smashing into the rock outcroppings, making it quite miserable to continue casting at this specific area. This was a much smaller fish, but very pretty nonetheless. I'll get him unhooked, and I'll toss him back into the water. Overall, it was just a great day out here on the Pacific coast. I caught quite a handful of surf perch species for the camera, and it was just a very pleasant day to be out here on the coast. Fall is coming along quite nicely here in Northern California. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, tight lines y'all.